And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greetings, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Friday, October 11th, 2024. And we start out with the sea ice and ice. We're in the early stages of the early season of the new ice year. Early development beginning to take shape along areas of the Arctic coast. We still have this remnant area of ice off of the Russian Arctic coast, but that's been there all through the summer. And now we're looking at new ice formation just beginning to start to take place, and that will gradually accelerate as even colder temperatures begin to overspread the region. But certainly there is some colder air in place. We have significant snowfall, heavier snowfall, winter storm warnings anticipated this weekend, especially as we go through Saturday night into Sunday morning across the Brooks Range, North Slope, and up along the Arctic coast. So definitely colder air is being drawn southward along the west coast in response to this large area of low pressure. This is a pretty powerful low, even though the central pressure will bottom out just a bit below 960 millibars. The wind field around it is very strong, especially coming down here through the Pribilofs and eastern Aleutians, and then along this particular occluded front as it works its way up past Cook Inlet to the western Gulf. We've seen some wind gusts upwards of hurricane force with high wind warnings and storm warnings. And as we go through tonight and into Saturday, we're going to find high winds overspreading the Panhandle, especially the outer and southern portions of the Panhandle, Sitka, down through Prince of Wales Island, and Ketchikan, Metlakatla are under high wind warnings, gusts to 60 miles an hour there. We've had earlier, at least in the day, Friday, hurricane force wind warning for the Barren Islands, lower Cook Inlet, including Kamishak Bay, and of course the highlands there around the Katmai area have seen some wind gusts up close to 100 miles an hour as a result of just very strong easterly flow along this frontal boundary. And that's all gradually lifting to the northeast and will eventually weaken. But that energy is going to spread moisture across the interior in areas, especially north of the Yukon River, up here and through the south slopes of the Brooks Range and the north slope, and along the Arctic coast. We'll get some heavier snowfall here as we go through later in the day, Friday and into Sunday. So by Saturday afternoon, we have the low still down there around 962 millibars south of Kodiak Island in the North Pacific, with the occluded front wrapped up around it, and areas of moderate to locally heavy rain across the Gulf Coast, Panhandle areas. Rainfall amounts could be as much as 1.5 inches to 4 inches at sea level here in through areas of the Panhandle. And then, of course, heavier snowfall in the coastal mountains, Wrangell, St. Elias, and back there toward Thompson Pass could easily pick up a foot or more of snow as that moisture continues to push northward. And then for Sunday, we find the low just southeast of Kodiak Island coming back up to about 974 millibars. But again, very active and stormy weather here across the Gulf and Gulf Coast, as well as back on the backside of the low here coming down along the west side of the state into the eastern Aleutians. Colder air beginning to push then up across northern areas of the mainland. And so winds on Saturday, gale force southeasterly winds 35 knots here. Stevens Passage down through Dixon Entrance for the inner channels, waves 6-7 feet. South winds 25 knots there, Lynn Canal. But the outer coast, we're looking at southeast to easterly gales, 40-45 knots, as high as 50-knot easterly storm force winds, Cape Suckling. Look at the waves get up there toward Cape Suckling in excess of 30-35 feet. So quite a potent system. And then on Sunday, winds do come down along with waves. Southeast to south winds 20 to 25 knots within the inner channels. Highest waves running 5 feet or so. Stevens Passage down to Dixon Entrance around Metlakatla. For the outer coast, look for southeast to east winds 30 knots with waves generally running between 15 to near 20 feet. Now, the strongest winds are going to be associated with this front working its way up along the northwestern Gulf Coast. Now, for Friday afternoon, during the day Friday, it was down in this region. That's going to be shifting up to outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance. So we're expecting 55 to 60 knot sustained storm force winds out of the southeast here outside of Hinchinbrook entrance with gust to hurricane force 70 knots. Within the area, more protected area of Prince William Sound, southeast winds to 35 knots with some potentially higher gusts, but the strongest winds out here over the open waters of the Gulf. And then for the area down along Anchor Point, Lower Cook Inlet, northeast winds to 50 knot, storm force winds, 17 to 20 foot waves. Even Upper Cook Inlet, north winds to 40 knots with 11 foot waves. And Sunday winds will come down across the region, generally easterly winds to 30 knots within Prince William Sound outside of Hinchinbrook entrance off the Kenai coast. 7 foot waves within Prince William Sound. 15-foot waves outside of Hinchinbrook entrance and along the Kenai coast, and then look for 30 to 35 knot winds there within the lower half of Cook Inlet with waves 8 to 9 feet. North Cook Inlet, 25 knot winds out of the northeast and 6 foot waves. So we have one of the low circulation does bring up winds a little lighter Saturday in the vicinity of Kodiak Island. Southwest winds 25 knots, and then they turn around to the northeast to north. And as you get down along the length of the Alaska Peninsula, they pick back up to 40 knot northerly gale force winds, waves in excess of 20 feet there. The northern Aleutians, and they're just to the northwest of Cold Bay. On Sunday, look for northeast winds 25 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, including Shelikof Strait. And then winds go back more northerly there within Bristol Bay, 20 knots, and then kind of turn back around to the northwest, 30 to 35 knots there, especially up through north of Cold Bay, where waves running 15 to 17 feet. Eastern Aleutians on Saturday, strongest winds 45 knot gales out of the northwest over the eastern Aleutians with gusts to 60 knots possibly through some of the gaps. Waves upwards of 25 feet or so here on the north side of the eastern Aleutians on the Bering side. And then as we go back out to the west, northwest winds 35, 40 knots, Atka to Adak, and then they shift back to the north and northeast and fall off from 25 to 30 to 15 to 20 knots towards Shemya. On Sunday, strongest winds still continue over the eastern Aleutians, but they're coming down. Northwesterly gales to 35 knots on Alaska through Nikolsky. And then as we get back toward the west, further west, winds become more westerly, west of Adak, 15 knots, and then turn back around ahead of the next system out there, way in the western Aleutians, going southeast to south at 30 knots there near Shemya. Still very strong northerly flow along the west side of the state and in through St. Matthew, the Pribilofs. We're looking at 45 knot northerly gales with gusts to 60 knots, potentially around the Pribilofs. Waves in the Pribilofs vicinity of the Pribilofs, you get away from the islands around and just over 20 feet. Look for northerly gales, 45 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, 25 knot northerly winds there out of Bristol Bay, and then along the lower Yukon coast and that wider expanse of the Norton Sound between Nome and Emonic. We're looking at northerly gales, 40, 45 knots, waves 8 to 9 feet. Sunday winds will come down to 35 to 40 knots a bit, but still brisk northerly flow, gale force 35 to 40 knot winds all the way from off the western portion of Norton Sound, YK Delta, and west of Nunavik Island down through St. Matthew, St. Paul, waves 15 to 17 feet, St. Matthew to St. Paul. And then through the Bering Strait, north side of St. Lawrence Island, west side of the Seward Peninsula, 40 knot northerly gales, waves 10 to 14 feet. As we get up through the Chukchi Sea, northeast to north winds 25 to 30 knots, 6 to 8 foot seas. And then as we get out along the Arctic coast, east-northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, Utqiagvik toward Kaktovik. And on Sunday, winds will become more northerly along the Arctic coast, 15 knots Kaktovik, but increasing 30 knots Prudhoe Bay through Utqiagvik. And as we drop on down through the lower Chukchi Sea, look for 30 to 40 knot winds through the Bering Strait, and those winds continue there, the Bering Strait down along to the north side of St. Lawrence Island and along the west side of the Seward Peninsula there at Wales and Teller, with waves running 10 to 13 feet through that area of the Bering Strait and north side of St. Lawrence Island on Sunday.